Terrific. Okay. Well, we're going to be, this next hour, zipping through an awful lot of material. I see some of you have notes with pens. Just put them down. You can get the PowerPoint from me afterwards. Just come up and see me. Have a USB drive. I'll slap it over to you. I have about 100 slides I've got to get through. And what we're going to do today, I'm not going to talk so much about the Quran. That'll be tomorrow. We're going to look at how the Quran was put together and what we now know about the earliest manuscripts. Some of you were probably here yesterday when we did the debate on the Quran with Dr. Edip Yüksel. We pretty well destroyed the Quran yesterday. Today we're going to destroy Muhammad and how Islam began. And I say that without any apologies, because I certainly say that at Speaker's Corner. I do this in London, and the Muslims need to hear that we are now finding out an entirely different message concerning Islam from what they've been telling us for the last, not 1,400 years, but 1,300 years. Now, what do Muslims claim? Well, they claim that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet. They claim that the Quran was his final revelation. Therefore, Islam is the final religion. It's the greatest of all, certainly the Abrahamic religions, and it's the final one of those three. Everything Muslims are dependent on are two things. They're dependent on the book and the man, the book and the man, the book and the man. The book is the Quran, the man is Muhammad. Without Muhammad, without the Quran, Islam falls. And that's why we're spending so much of our energies zeroing in on the book and the man. The same paradigm fits for us. We are also dependent on another book and another man. The book called the Bible, the man Jesus Christ. A bigger book, a bigger man. So that's why, since we start from the same paradigm, we probably understand them better than anybody else. That's why it's important that we engage in this debate. The secular world, the humanist, the atheist, they don't understand what we're talking about. They don't understand the power of one book and one man, like Muslims and Christians and Jews can. So that's why in some ways what we're going to introduce today and tomorrow is we should be at the forefront of this discussion. And that's why I want to introduce these two different themes these 2 days. Let's start then with Muhammad. What do we know about him? Well, according to the classical account, and this is what you have been taught, this is what's taught in all our schools, this is what's taught in our seminaries, our Bible schools, well, this is what's been taught everywhere. That Muhammad was born in 570. He started receiving his revelations in the cave, the Hira cave in 610. From 610 to 622, the next 12 years, he received what we know as the Meccan surahs, which are the latter part of the Quran, from around Surah 20 onto the 114. And then in 621, he is woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak. He flies up to Jerusalem, and he goes up to the seven heavens, meets God, or Allah, who tells him to pray 50 times a day. Comes down 2 heavens, meets Moses, who asks him how many times, and he says 50. He says, that's way too many. See if you can get it back down. So he jumps back up to the 7th heaven, and he bounces back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, bringing the number of prayers from 50 to 45 to 40, down, right on down to 5. When he gets to 5 prayers, Moses says, that's fine, go on back down. And so he does, comes to Jerusalem and flies back down to to Mecca. Now, that's in 621. That's known as the Mi'raj. The Mi'raj. And of course, the next year, 622, he then moves from Mecca up to Medina with maybe 80 to 200 followers. It depends on which tradition you're going to follow. And then from 622 to 632, that last 10 years, he receives the Medinan revelations, and that's the much larger part of it's half the Quran. Nonetheless, it has the largest surahs. And then in 630, he goes down to Mecca, defeats it without firing a shot, and he dies in 632. 2 years, next 2 years, Abu Bakr takes over. He dies peacefully. Then he is followed by Umar till 644. He is killed. Uthman takes over from 644 to 656. He is killed, and then Ali takes over from 656 to 61, and he is killed. Now, that's known as the 4 rightly guided caliphs, from 632 to 661. That's known as the Rashidun period. That's the golden period of Islam. That's what ISIS and all the other groups want to take us back to, that golden period. Actually, it starts from 624 to 661, so roughly 40 years. That's the golden period. Now, have any of you heard any other story than what I've just said? No hands are raised. There's no reason to hear any other story. This is the only story we have ever heard for the last, you'd like to say 1,400 years. It's not 1,400 years. Everything I have just talked about is right there in that red area right there. So basically from 570 to 661. But where do we get this information from? Where does any of this come from? Were they written down by people who knew Muhammad, who were actually there, who were eyewitnesses to what he said and did? No, none at all. Everything we know, everything I've just been telling you, all the stories and all this skeletal reference to Muhammad's life was first written down by a man named Ibn Ishaq. Well, that's 765. That's the late 8th century. We don't have any of his material. We're therefore dependent on another man named Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham was writing this down around 833. So that's 200 years after Muhammad died. We have really nothing earlier than Ibn Hisham in written form today about what Muhammad did. That's the Siratu Rasulullah. That would be the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. His sayings come quite a bit later. They are first written down and compiled in their final form by a man named Al-Bukhari. He dies in 870. You can see, therefore, this red area here. There you can see Ibn Hisham. That's 240 years after the Prophet died. When you get to the Tafsir and the Tahqiq, which would be the commentaries on the Quran, and the Tahqiq would be the histories of mankind, when you get to that genre of material, they're first tabulated by a man named Al-Tabari, who died in 923. So everything we know that happens in this part of the world, of this time period, from the 7th century, is not written down till the 9th and 10th century. Does that bother any of you? It should bother all of you. We have to wait 200 to 300 years to hear about this man, that place, the book, and this religion. 200 years of what? Well, so-and-so got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so. These are called isnad. Isnads are nothing more than a chain of names that are relating oral tradition. All based on oral tradition. 200 years of oral tradition. And for what reason? Let's look at Jesus. We know quite a bit about Jesus. Another historical figure. We know that the people that were there, actually, we know quite a bit about his life. We have 3 biographies of his life that were written before 60 AD, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew was actually an eyewitness to what he was writing. Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. John would have been written much later, about 90 AD. But certainly within 60 years, you have 4 witnesses of Jesus' sirah, what he did, and 4 witnesses of Jesus' hadith, what he said, the red letter part of the gospel account. All written within 60 years, 2 by eyewitnesses and 2 by those who knew the eyewitnesses. We have Paul's letter, which were starting to be written down within 15 years of Christ's death. So you have the tafsir. Paul's letters would be the tafsir. That would be the equivalent, the commentaries of what Jesus said and did, how he applied it to there in Philippi, in Ephesus, in Galatia. The histories would be the book of Acts. The book of Acts would have been written between 52 and 62 AD. That's within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death. So you have the seerah, you have the hadith of Jesus, you have the tafsir of Jesus, and you have the tahqiq of Jesus. All 4 genres of what we know as their Islamic tradition. We have the traditions of Jesus written down within 40 to 60 years of Christ's death. Now you do a comparison, and you can see which is better. I'd rather go with 15 to 60 years of Christ's death rather than 200 to 300 years of Muhammad's death. If we were dependent on Jesus Christ, what the Muslims are dependent on, that means we know nothing about Jesus Christ until the 3rd century. And we could not prove his historicity. Can you see what Muslims are up against? And why is it we haven't asked this question before? So the 21st century historical scholars are now asking this question. This is what they're saying. Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. The conclusion is that the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, 685 to 705, that's his dates, and before, is a later fabrication. Now that's a big thing to say. Let's now prove it, and let's see what they're doing. And this is why they're asking this question. If so much of the history of Islam is written down so late, why did it take so long to write it down? Could these people read and write? Were they not literate? Absolutely. We know that by 642, the Arab world had moved, and these Arabs, I'm not going to call them Muslims yet, you'll see why, these Arabs had taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, the 5 great cities of the Levant. So within 10 years of Muhammad's death, they already controlled those 5 cities. By the time Abd al-Malik comes to power in 685, they had swept right across North Africa, all the way to Spain in the west, to India in the east, was all under their control. Are you telling me that no one could read and write between Spain and India? Are you saying that there were no literate people in Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, or Cairo? Was there not a library that was burnt in the 5th century in Alexandria? What are you burning if you're not burning books? What is a library for if it's not books? More than that, it's very clear in Sahih Bukhari, volume 6, 510 and 509, 510, it's very clear that the Quran was written down at the time of Abu Bakr, 2 years after Muhammad's death, between 632 and 634, the first recension. What did they write down? Zayd ibn Thabit is the one credited with that. He was the secretary of Muhammad. How could you be a secretary if you can't read and write? Obviously they could read and write. So why did they not write anything down about this greatest prophet in the history of mankind, this greatest religion in the history of mankind, and what about the Quran? Where is it? We'll get on that tomorrow. What about the biographers? Where did these 9th century biographers get their material from? Sahih Bukhari is related that he was given 600,000 of these akhbars. And of the 600,000, he was to whittle them down and bring them down to only those that were authentic. And so he did that, whittled them down, and brought it down to 7,397. That means he threw out 98% and only retained 2%. Why? Where did he get the other 98% from? And what happened to that 98%? Wouldn't you like to read it? I'd like to read it. I'd like to know what he'd thrown out. Well, that's exactly why the historians are asking this question. Therefore, they're saying, should we trust this material from the 9th and 10th century? And shouldn't we rather go back to the 7th century and find what actually happened? So let's see what they're finding. Now remember, let's look at a map here so you see what I'm talking about. You can see here's where Islam was up to, the brown area, up until 661. Then it moved right across over up to Andalusia, which is Spain today, and India over here, the Mughal Empire, further they came later on. But that's where they had already controlled by the end of the 7th century, the end of the 7th century by the time of Abd al-Malik, just to get that picture. Now the material that I'm going to be using comes from some of the best, finest scholars in the world today. Men like Dr. John Wansborough, head of School of Oriental African Studies. He is the one that wrote the 2 books that blew this whole question open in the 1970s called Quranic Studies and Sector and Milieu. Dr. Jaron Hotting, who was my professor in 1994. When I first came across it, I did my first debate on this in 1995. We're talking about 21 years ago. I did my debate on this with Dr. Jamal Badawi at Cambridge University. And I used Hotting's material along with Dr. Patricia Corona out of Denmark. In fact, she was my supervisor at that time. I was with her the night before at Cambridge University. And she gave me 10 historical challenges. Those 10 historical challenges are still up on the internet. They're on our debate site. They have yet to be answered. And that was 21 years ago. So that was in 1995 that we started asking these questions publicly. 1995, Dr. Patricia Corona was probably the most devastating woman to go to because this woman reads and writes 15 languages, all archaic languages. How many of you can read and write 15 archaic languages? That's why she's so difficult to confront, because she reads everything in their original language. And a lot of times she does not translate it for our benefit because she does not want Muslims to read what she's translating. She has now deceased as of last year, unfortunately. Dr. Andrew Rippon out of Calgary has probably taken this material and put it into the easiest form, the easiest book to read on it. Dr. Robert Hoyland, another one of our supervisors when he was at Oxford University, at that time he could read and write 18 languages. These people are linguists of the first order, and that's why they're so devastating to be able to confront. Dr. Yehuda Nevo out of Jerusalem, who has done the best work on the early inscriptions from the Negev Desert, of the earliest Arab inscriptions. And in the German school, Dr. Gunther Luning, who has written the best material on the Syriac writings. Dr. Gerhard Prin, Dr. von Bothmer, Dr. Oleg, who are the ones who have taken and done the best work on the earliest manuscripts. Some of their material I'll introduce tomorrow. So we have all of these people are coming out of Europe. They're not from America. These are Europeans, and they're way ahead of us in Europe on this. This is why it's so good to be in Europe, to get their material firsthand, and to be able to work with them, and to talk to them face to face, and to see where they're going with this. And it's going to learn, then there's 2 books that have come out. One was, did I go past that slide? No. 2 new books have come out and 1 documentary, one by Dr. Tom Holland. Dr. Tom Holland wrote this book in 2012. He took 6 years to write it, going back to all those, the scholars that I just mentioned in the slide before, and he took the material and tried to put it down into layman's terminology so you and I can understand it. And that's the book came out in 2012 that asked these very historical questions. He then put it into a documentary, just an hour-and-a-half documentary, which you cannot see here in the United States. We can see it in Europe still, but you're not permitted here. And it's interesting because that documentary was shown on Channel 4 television in England on August 28, 2012. It caused such a furore amongst the Muslim community that when they wanted to show it again in November of that year, they could not because of all the Muslims that confronted it. And all he did was to take the conclusions. Well, he didn't even do that. He just took the assumptions from the book. He didn't come to any conclusions. He let the viewers come to their own conclusions. If any of you want that video, I have it on my computer. I can give that to you also afterwards if you have a USB drive. But then another book came out in 2012. Dan Gibson is a friend of some of you here. Some of you know who he is. Dan Gibson is a Canadian. His father was an archaeologist. He's been an archaeologist. For 30 years, he's worked in the Muslim world. He lives there amongst them, learned the languages, and he was the one that has probably done the most devastating work of actually asking the pertinent questions concerning the geography of Islam and also the problem with Mecca and the Qibla. There has been a brand new documentary that's just come out called The Sacred City. I think there's a leaflet going around. If any of you do have a chance, get the documentary. It only costs $15. It just came out a month ago. And some of the material that I'm going to be introducing this afternoon comes from that documentary, put out and done by Dan Gibson. And it's this material that the Muslims are going to have to contend with, because we introduced this back in 1994. I introduced it in 1995 in my debate. This is now 2016, and no Muslim has come to an answer on this material that we're going to introduce now, especially on Mecca. So let's look, and I'm going to give you their conclusion before then I prove how they came to these conclusions. This is what they're finding. The first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad is not introduced till 691. Did you hear that? We know nothing about this man Muhammad from within Arab sources. Externally, we know about him. We have the Doctrina ai Iacobi in the British Library, 634. We also have the writings of Sabaeus in 660. But we don't have any Arab reference to his name until 691. That's curious. That means for 60 years, the Arabs didn't know this man. The first reference to the name Muslim is not introduced until the 690s. So what did these Arabs call themselves? Well, they call themselves Saracens. They call themselves Haggarins from the line of Hagar. They call themselves Ishmaelites from the line of Ishmael. They call themselves Maghrites from the area of the Maghreb. They call themselves Mahajurun, which would people of the Hijr, people of the Exodus. These are the nomadic people. So they did give their names, but they didn't use the word Muslim. Isn't that curious? The first reference to the religion called Islam is not till 691, and that's on the Dome of the Rock. The first reference to Mecca, here's the worst part. The first reference we can find to the city of Mecca is not till 741. And the first biography of Muhammad does not get written down till 833. Now, let's unpack that. That's an awful lot to take in just a few minutes. Let's start with geography, and let's look at what Dan Gibson was noting. He noticed when he looked to the Quran that there are about 65 geographical locations in the Quran. And over again, this prophet, though it doesn't give him a name, over and over again, it refers to the representative of God, the prophet of God, over and over again. Only 4 times in the Quran will you find Muhammad's name. This prophet, it says, always has this contact, and had over and over again, has contact with people from 3 different tribes. 23 times he has contact with people from Uz. 24 times he has contact with people from the Thamud, which would be the Nabateans. I'm sorry, did I say Uz? I meant Ud. So you have 23 times contact with people from Ud, which is the biblical Uz. 24 times the people from Thamud, which would be the Nabateans. And 7 times these people from Midian, which would be the Midianites. Over and over again, yet here's the curiosity. Take a look and see where the Ud, Thamud, and Midian are. They're way up here. Here's Mecca, way down here. That's 600 miles between them. How could he have daily contact with these people who live 600 miles further north? Unless, of course, he was flying in a jet back and forth every day. You can see the problem immediately. And that's the first thing that he came across. He said, this cannot be. You cannot have this much contact with people from so far away. When you look at the Quranic geographical locations, you will find there are 65 geographical locations in the Quran. We have 110 geographical locations in the book of Luke. 9 places are named in the Quran, 31 places are named in the book of Luke. 600 miles too far north, whereas every one in the Gospel of Luke are correct. But let's unpack it a little bit more. Let's look at Mecca, and this is, I think, is where the most problematic area is. I have yet to find a Muslim that can explain this next part that I'm going to share with you. And we've been bringing it down to Speaker's Corner. We've been introducing it in many of our debates. Muslims will not touch Mecca. You'll see why. Now, what we do know about Mecca, well, we only have one reference to it in the Quran. That's in Surah 48, Ayah 24. Other than that, it's just called the place of the Prophet, or the area of the Prophet. There's no reference other than 48, verse 24. We do know, according to the traditions, that's the tafsir, in the tahqiq, in the hadith, in the sirah, that it's in a valley and that it has a parallel valley, that it has a stream going right through it, that it has a pillar of salt. This prophet, as he goes out in the day, he passes by the pillar of salt, which is referring to Lot's wife, in the morning, and then comes back past that same pillar of salt in the evening. So it must be right outside of Mecca. According to the traditions, this Mecca has fields, it has clay, it has grass, it has trees, it has olive trees. That's curious. Olive trees. And that it has mountains overlooking the Kaaba. The problem is, none of you have been to Mecca, you're not permitted, but if you've seen pictures, and anybody that has been to Mecca, you know it's not in a valley. You know that there is not a parallel valley. There are no mountains overlooking the Kaaba. The closest mountains are about 5 kilometers away. There is no clay, grass, or loam. There has never been any clay, grass, or loam. And there certainly are no olive trees in Mecca, because there are no olive trees in all of Arabia. The only olive trees that grow up in the Mediterranean world, which is 600 miles further north. There you go again, 600 miles further north. It has no stream going through it. It has no water. It only has one well called the Zamzam well, and that's one of the reasons why Patricia Corona picked up and went on from there. But let's just deal with that later. We'll come back to that. Mecca, we do know, is at the center of Islam. It is absolutely important that Mecca should exist, because what we do know is that possibly it was the first place that Adam and Eve were sent to. Remember, Adam and Eve, according to Surah 7, were up in the Garden of Eden, which is up in space. It was not on earth. And in verse 24, when they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, they were thrown down, according to the traditions, down to Mecca, which would make it the oldest inhabitant in the history of mankind. According to Surah 21, Abraham was in Mecca. He goes into the Kaaba and destroys the idol. So certainly in 1900 BC, I had no idea Abraham was in Mecca, but according to the Quran, he was. That would mean Mecca would be at least as old as 1900 BC. We know from the traditions that Muhammad was not only a trader, but Mecca was the center of trade, north, south, east, and west. And that's why it enriched itself. That's why it got its importance. We know that Muhammad was born there. Supposedly, he then moved from there in 622. And that it became the center of the Qibla in 624. After 2 years of there, when the Qibla was moved back up to Jerusalem, it was then returned back down to Mecca, according to Surah 2, Ayah 143 to 150. Yet there's only one reference to it, and that's in Surah 48, Ayah 24. Now take a look at this map. What's wrong? What's missing? This is a Byzantine map of the trade routes in green. Where's Mecca on this map? Here's a 7th century Arab trade route map. Do you see what else is missing? It should be right where the question mark is. Here's a 6th century map. Mecca doesn't exist on this map. Here's a 7th century map. Mecca still doesn't exist. Looks like it's still missing on another 7th century map. And yet another 7th century map. Mecca is just non-existent on any map. We can't find it on any map. In the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, up until the 7th century. Dr. Patricia Corona was curious about this, and she looked at this map here, which is a facsimile of what it would have looked like in the 7th century. And she noticed the trade route. Now, since you're over here, I'm going to be pointing over here, but if you want to come over here and see, this is the Arabian Sea, and here's where all the spices were coming from the western coast of India, and also over here in China. And they used to come across the Arabian Sea up into the Persian Gulf to get over to the Mediterranean world. Now, Dr. Montgomery Watt is the one that came up with the trade route theory that supported the notion that during the 5th and 6th century, the Sassanids over here were warring with the Byzantines who are over here. The Byzantines and the Sassanids, Persians and Christians, warred for about 200 years, which shut down the Persian Gulf. So the trade had to be redirected down to here, across the Arabian Sea, over to Aden. And then when they went up 1,250 miles, right up the west coast of Arabia, up starting in Aden in the south, going to Najran, Sana, up to Taif, up down to Mecca, up to Yathrib, to Khaybar, Tabuk, Khaybar, and then up to Gaza in the north. That's the trade route theory. Have you all heard about this theory? It certainly helps out the Meccans enormously, because that supports the notion, therefore, that Mecca would have been on the trade route and would control the trade all the way from the south up into the north, from Aden up to Gaza. No one's really disputed that until Patricia Corona looked a little more carefully at the map. I don't know if you can tell, but if you look at the map carefully, you will notice when it comes up here to Taif, it then goes down, comes down, and has to then go back up to get to Yathrib. I'm shaking so much because it's so far away. Look at my PowerPoint when you get it, and you'll see it. It comes down from Taif, 1,000 meters down to get down to Mecca, then it has to go up 1,000 meters to get back up to Yathrib again. Why would there be any caravans? Why would they want to come off the plateau 1,000 feet, then go back up to get up to Yathrib when there's no water there to begin with? And it's not on any map. So where were they going? And where did this map come from? This map was not from the 7th century. This is from the 9th century and the 10th century, redacting it back to what they thought happened in the 7th century. So she decided to find out, well, let's look and see if there was any trade through Mecca. Now, remember, this woman reads and writes 15 languages. So she went back and she went through all the trading documents, starting with the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. God bless her. She didn't bother to translate any of them for us. But what she did find is that there was no reference anywhere to a place called Mecca in any of the trading documents. In fact, the Arabs were not in charge of the trade. What she found was that the Africans here, the Andalusians, Andalus right there, was in all of the trading documents. And the reason is very clear. My 10-year-old son saw the reason. Let's see if you can find the reason. Anybody see what's wrong with the trade route theory? Take a hard look at the map and see what's wrong. Anybody want to venture a guess? Go ahead.
It's easier to go up water than across.
Good man, give him an A. Exactly. Why would you start on boats over here, come across the Arabian Sea, take off all your goods here and go 1,250 miles by land when you have a waterway going right up the side, the Red Sea? Why didn't they keep them on board boats? Well, this is exactly what she found. All the trade was maritime. It's much cheaper to send goods by water than it is by land. If you take a ton of goods, she found, and send it just 50 miles by land, it's the same cost as 1,250 miles by sea. That's why even today, all of our goods, our cars, and all of our large vehicles, and anything that's sent from one country to another, it's sent by ship, because it's so much cheaper than sending anything by land. Why hadn't no one noticed this before? So she noticed it, and so she wrote a whole book about it, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, published in 1987. She was given a death threat because of that book. And so she had to move from Oxford to Cambridge University. And that's when I met her, when she was at Cambridge. And then she noticed that she couldn't find any reference to Mecca. So she scoured all the trading documents. She went and she found documents from way up here in Ctesiphon, which is now Baghdad. They had come down over here to Yathrib, and they found silver outside of Yathrib, which is now today called Medina. The archaic name was Yathrib. And she looked at their documents, and they're just northeast of Mecca, but there's no reference to Mecca in any of their documents. They didn't know about this place. That's rather curious. If it's the center of the world, if it's the oldest city in history, if it's where Abraham lived, it's where Muhammad was living, it's where Islam began, no one heard about this city. The first reference she could find for Mecca was not to the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, Continuata Byzantia Arabica, written in 741. Muhammad died in 632. Can you see the problem? The first time it's recorded on any map is not till 900 AD. That's the 10th century. We don't see anything recorded on any map of this place called Mecca. Well, take a look at modern Mecca today. There's the 4th highest building in the world that they have now built in Mecca, the largest clock tower modeled on Big Ben itself over down here, and they are now building all around it. This looks down right onto the Kaaba, and all around it now, they are building what they want to do for the future. And one of those is going to be chosen as the future of Mecca. They are cementing the entire city up. Today, they're expanding, and you can see there's the clock tower. It's 45 feet across, that clock tower. It's going to be, they want to make it Meccan Mean Time. They want to take Greenwich Mean Time and change it to Meccan Mean Time, so all our clocks are going to be designated to that clock. But all around the Kaaba there are now all these cranes. You see that? They're all digging it all up.